attention. The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to a special episode of 1 of 200. We are talking with Dr. Josephine Varghese about her recent trip to Cuba and the events that unfolded when she was there. Hello, Josephine.
Kia ora, everyone. Wonderful to be here with you, Kieran, and excited to talk about all my experiences of being in Cuba at a very interesting time in the world.
It certainly was. Before we go on, though, could you, you went there for a conference called the Tricontinental Conference. It was the 60th anniversary, I believe, of a landmark conference. Maybe you could describe that for the listeners.
Yeah, so you're right, Kieran. So I went there for this a conference. It was an academic conference, activist conference, kind of a combination of this. It was organized during the 60th anniversary of the original Tricontinental Conference, which happened in 1966, January, in Havana, Cuba. And this conference was quite a landmark conference because the people organizing it included Fidel Castro, but also revolutionaries and anti-colonial, anti-imperialist fighters from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific. Sorry, not the Pacific, but Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And predominantly, they had participants from, in the original conference, from Latin America and Africa, although there were also a big presence of people from Asia as well, including Palestinian delegation as well as Vietnamese delegations. The Palestinian delegation in the original Tricontinental Conference was quite important because this was the moment, the way that this historically, when we read about this conference, what I read is that this was one of the moments when the Palestinian movement kind of took an international character. So that the original conference was quite an important chapter in anti-imperialism. You can say that it was a Western Hemisphere equivalent of the Bandung Conference, which was a conference of non-aligned nations, which happened in the 50s. And then shortly after that, in the next decade, in the 60s, the Tricontinental Conference happens in Havana. So although these two were similar in that both of them had this anti-colonial character, the Tricontinental Conference was more radical because it was when Bandung was more about diplomacy and, international relations, what kind of foreign policy to craft for the newly independent nations. The Tricontinental Conference kind of was more representative of the ongoing anti-colonial struggles that were going on. And it was more like there were more calls for armed rebellion against empire. So it was in its character more radical than the Bandung Conference. And it was also, we must remember that the original Tricontinental Conference, it was organized by revolutionaries from North Africa, Algeria, and Moroccan communists and anti-colonial leaders were some of the key organizers alongside Fidel. So this is post-revolutionary.
Yeah, whereas Bandung was very much a governmental sort of thing, wasn't it? And states that were fairly strong at the time coming together to form the non-aligned movement.
That's right. So it was already established states who in the independent era, like India, Egypt, Indonesia, Sukarno, Nehru, these kind of people, Nasser. So it was more a formal within kind of the framework of international diplomacy, whereas this was more a revolutionary conference in 1966, Havana. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So when did you travel to Cuba for this?
Yeah. So before I traveled to Cuba, obviously, I did I've been, as an anti-imperialist, I've been reading about Cuba for, some years. And so I know some of the key dates in Cuba. So January 1 is Victory Day. So I wanted to get there before Victory Day. It was the day that, December 31st is when, and the night of December 31st is when Batista fled the island. And the revolutionaries march into Havana on the 1st of January 1959. So I organized my travel so that I would be there before Victory Day. So I went there late December 2025, and I was there until late January, so about 20th of January.
Right. So
Yeah.
was Victory Day exciting time?
Yeah, so this is interesting. So I'll give you some information, but also I forgot to say what, my paper was about at the conference, and also,
Yeah. Oh, yes.
some of the key features of the conference, which, the listeners might be interested in.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
so so I arrived in late December, and this is a really difficult time in Cuba because the last 10 years since Trump won 1.0, Cuba has been struggling since then in terms of fuel and you know, vital supplies, primarily fuel and power. These two are connected, but also like even facing some issues in terms of procuring, like for example syringes for the health system and so forth. So this is what imperialism does. So Cuba has been under embargo for 6.5 decades, and each administration tunes it up and tunes it down a little bit, but ultimately the embargo continues. And what Trump did in 2017 when he, got sworn in as a president in 27, after the 2016 elections, he put Cuba in the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Now, this comes with a whole lot of legal entanglements. So this creates a lot of problems for countries that want to, trade with and support Cuba. And, Venezuela is under crisis. So Cuba's history is quite interesting because after the revolution, the revolution is a challenge to imperialism, isn't it? So the empire wants to strangle it. So post the revolution, we have the period when the Soviet support was there. But when, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Cuba entered the special period in the 90s. And then after that, when Chavez came, into power in Venezuela through the Bolivarian revolution there, which was through the ballot, right? It was a democratic one. Then Cuba got a new friend, which was really helpful, which was also contending with challenging imperialism. And then, as when I was there, was when basically USA was attacking Venezuela. They had already hijacked one of the tankers that was on its way from Venezuela to Cuba. They basically, stole Cuban oil on the way to Cuba. So the scarcity meant that the government had made decisions to have low-key celebrations, and so there wasn't a huge amount of stuff going on. I went to the Revolution Square and paid my respects to the leaders of the revolution. But apart from that, the government didn't make a lot of, didn't make a huge number of public events on that day. But it was really interesting to see the culture of Cuba on Revolution Day, the TV programs, but also what the Cuban people did. Cuban people have a lot of, I think there's focus on rest and relaxation during the holidays.
Yeah.
And until that day, Havana was humming, humming.
Yeah.
And then on the morning of the revolution, the Victory Day, it was so quiet and people were just chilled out in their homes with their families. And it was a nice walk for me to the Revolution Square that day. But
Yes.
yeah,
Of
yeah.
course, Aotearoa used to have a similar sort of thing, but tourists complained. One of them famously said, I visited New Zealand, but it was a Sunday and it was shut. Um, we can't have workers not being at the beck and call of tourists at all times. So
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right. But I think
so
we slowly lost that culture of
oh,
yeah.
absolutely, it's gone. It's long gone now. But
Mm. And that
yeah,
was the unions and all that, the demand for rest
mm,
being
absolutely.
prominent at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, was the culture too. Other thing I was just wanting to interject was maybe a little bit about why the US, or maybe not why so much as the fact that the US has this very strong determination to crush Cuba. It's a long-standing
Yeah.
hobby of theirs. And
Yeah.
of course, firstly, of course, historically, they had very strong connections, but not just governmental and covert connections, but also with the organized crime being a big part of the Cuban scene. And then they also kept Guantanamo, part of Cuban soil, to
Yeah.
themselves to this day, which they just keep because they can and without
Mm.
any excuse. So,
Mm.
yeah. So, yeah, any
So
comments on
why?
why
Yeah.
they,
Yeah.
or at least, I mean, we kind of, yeah,
Yeah.
clearly they just refuse to have anything that close to them that is remotely defiant. But could you characterize how
Yeah.
badly they've been going after Cuba for this time?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is a good segue into talking a little bit more about what I learned from the conference, and
Mm-hmm.
because these things were discussed at detail in the conference.
Mm-hmm.
So why? So you mentioned the proximity. Proximity is one thing, but whether you're proximate or not, you don't have to be a Cuba, you
Yeah,
can be
true.
all the way on the other side of the world. So many countless countries that have been toppled because they have defied US imperialism. So why? So this is a good, let me go to the conference. I'll take you to the conference, the University of Havana, beautiful buildings, you know, all currently state-owned or owned by, normal families. But University of Havana, this gorgeous campus. And I was there. The conference started in like this beautiful Great Hall. I don't know if that's what it's called, but I'm gonna call it the Great Hall because that's how wonderful it was. And we had a number of keynotes, very important keynotes. And one of the keynotes was from Palestinian students who were studying with Cuban scholarship.
Mhm.
Cuba has supported, thousands of students from around the world. Over 1,500 Palestinian doctors have been trained. Still, training is ongoing. Um, Doctors from Asia, Africa, Latin America, also or doctors from economically marginalized sections in the United States being trained in Havana, in Cuba, and other parts of Cuba as well. So this student who was one of our keynote speakers, he said his presentation was amazing. There was a little documentary called From Gaza to Cuba. It moved most of the conference participants to tears because it kind of shows, how Cuba, despite all its challenges, continues in its path of, internationalism, real solidarity. Cuba upholds a model of internationalism that is so unique in the face of global exploitative globalized capitalism. So it's really a challenge to the dominant model of globalization, really. And this student, after we had the documentary and the presentation, and I rose up and I said, I am from, I'm originally from Kerala in India. And the moment I say I'm from Kerala, everyone in Cuba starts clapping. People know Kerala there. So I wasn't expecting it, and people gave me a round of applause just for being from Kerala. Anyway, I digress. um, so I said, your presentation was so good because it shows the connected nature of the struggles in different parts of the world, whether it is Gaza or whether it is Cuba. We are in the same struggle against this imperial system, which is crushing the rights of people and also our planet, right? It's causing genocides, it's causing so much strife to people and the planet. And then he said, yes, indeed, that's true. And he said, Palestine is being crushed and strangled because of its geostrategic importance in this in this region, the Middle East, which is so important as a trade route, geopolitically, but also for its resources. The Middle East is still one of the most important strategically and resource-rich regions in the world, and this is the reason why empire is so intent on crushing sovereign movements over there, and it demands bent knees there. And he said, but Cuba is being strangled for a slightly different reason. Cuba's not so resource rich like the Middle East, but Cuba represents perhaps an even bigger threat. And that threat is that of an idea, the idea with which to dismantle imperialism that exists and it's alive in Cuba. And this is why the empire wants to strangle Cuba. And this was, I mean, just well put, right? And at some point of the presentation, so there was, both female and male students presenting, and they said in Cuba, when you come for an education as a, medical professional in Cuba, you don't just become a medical professional or a doctor. Like Che Guevara, we become revolutionaries. And so when I heard this answer from this Palestinian student called Murid Abu Katir, I just thought, indeed, they are training revolutionaries here. So, yeah, that's a little snippet. But I also want to say, like in the beginning, I talked about how Cuba is struggling in terms of, supplies. But I also want to talk about a contrast that I experienced, because when I traveled to Cuba, I avoided the United States and I went through Canada. Obviously, it's not safe to go through the United States, for any reason, let alone going to Cuba, which can raise a lot of questions. And, if you're a New Zealand citizen and if you apply for a US visa, but your final destination is Cuba, you can't just apply for an e-visa, which is the normal process. They ask you to go to Auckland and give an interview at the US consulate. So, I mean, that didn't really apply to me because, but at the same time, it's just not a good idea to go through the United States. So I went through Canada and I spent 7 days in Vancouver, which is one of the wealthiest cities in Canada. And as I was walking through the streets of Vancouver, this whole fentanyl crisis, the drug crisis of the United States, it has percolated into Canada as well, and it was visible on the streets of Vancouver. There were many homeless people in this horrible winter weather, on the streets. One of them collapsed while I was walking by, and the city just moves on as if it's normal. So we're getting people collapsing on the streets in one of the richest countries in the world, many of them just dying, overdosing, and the day just goes by, right? Nothing happens. Inequality is increasing, homelessness is increasing, precarity is increasing. And you come to Cuba, and yes, there is scarcities, especially due to the sanctions in the last so many years, but the population continues to be one of the healthiest, happiest, communally connected people, a safe country. But also, I couldn't see any homelessness. It's negligible. So I looked at the figures. It's all 95% or higher percent of people have homes, and it's negligible homelessness over there. So
yeah, you were talking about, of course, the threat of an idea. And
yeah,
I think there's more than one idea here, because I think Cuba has been economically strangled. It has few resources, and yet it has a higher life expectancy than the US by quite a margin.
Yeah.
And I think this was part of the problem with Chavismo as well, was that um, they ended
Improve the
extreme
condition.
poverty
That's
almost
right.
completely and so forth. And the lack of resource, what they do with less resources shows up how much poverty is maintained artificially in the West. And the other thing that is clear, well, and also enforced, of course, on the neo-colonies, the other thing that is clear is that the leaders in these countries, Hugo Chavez, Maduro, the all of the Cuban leaders have, and also Gaddafi. He stood up for
Mm-hmm.
whose son Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi was killed today.
Yeah,
By the way,
assassinated.
yeah.
Yeah.
So they all stood up publicly against the US empire in some way, and often they would reach out in solidarity to others, such as Cuba sending troops to Angola. But Gaddafi funded all sorts of freedom struggles all around the world,
That's
including,
right.
yeah, in Aotearoa, sent money to Maori activists. So yeah, I mean, of course, when they attack these people, it's all about their tyranny and so forth. But it does seem to be quite a they say it's about their tyranny, but it seems to be quite a regular pattern. It's the people who challenge their empire in various ways.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. And it's just an ongoing feature, isn't it? So
Mhm.
I really enjoyed your point, and I think it's a really important point to make that countries like Cuba show how solvable these, supposedly
Yes.
unsolvable problems are. It's so solvable. You don't need that many resources. It's just a question of what you use your limited, even if it's limited resources, how you use them is what makes the difference between solving a problem like poverty, which is, in my view, the biggest problem, right? Poverty, hunger, the basic material needs. I mean, at the end of the day, human beings are material beings. We're biological beings. We need certain basic things to survive. All other freedoms, everything else can only operate when we have those basic needs met. And without those basic needs, we are in a very disempowered state, extremely disempowered state. And that gives the people who own all that resources, which can solve our problems, even more powerful. And we become so disempowered at their feet because of this issue. And this is what revolutionaries like Fidel, Che Guevara, they all understood this, that this is the main contradiction is this. How can we address the you know the so urgent needs of the people, right? Prioritizing
Mm.
the most urgent needs of the people who have been enslaved, right? So when we were in Cuba, we walk around and we see these beautiful mansions, right? Like massive, luxurious mansions, which were
Mm.
owned by colonizers and were built by slave labor, and now black families are living there. And it's just, and that's Fidel talked about it. We also met at the conference. One of the keynotes was a Comandante Victor Dreke, who was the second in command of Che Guevara in Cuba's mission to Congo, and he was also one of the revolutionaries in the 26th July movement, which led to the Cuban Revolution, and him and his wife is an elected local representative. So this is the other thing. People think that, I mean, even so-called leftists or democratic socialists like Zohran Mamdani saying that Cuba is a dictatorship. I didn't feel that at all. These people were so free. And people like, I think her name is Anna, Victor Deke's partner. She is a elected representative in the local area. You don't even need to be a member of the the Communist Party of Cuba to be, elected to these governance positions, and they have a right to recall and all these things. And Victor Dreke and his wife, both of them were part of the movement of raising kind of the marginalized groups, especially enslaved people with the history of being enslaved, into the mainstream. And I just could feel Cuba was the most diverse in its true sense country that I've been to, right? The newsreader and prime time are black people, professors, high officials, the second most powerful person in the Cuban administration. There's just real diversity there in Cuba, I felt. It's not this fake inclusion that we see in the West, where, yeah, you can go up within the institutions if you speak their language and so forth. And if you abandon the cause of uplifting and liberating the people, this is actually a liberation project for workers and enslaved people, and they, coming to the top through that liberationary struggle rather than through co-optation into the oppressive system that enslaved them. So it's just really, in many ways, was so inspiring. And I got to meet Comandante Victor Dreke, and he was just, he's just full of spirit. He's 88 years old now. And each time he speaks, he spoke about revolutionary values. He was speaking about why Cuba decided to take part in the anti-apartheid struggle. Over 3,000 Cubans were killed in that struggle, were martyred in that struggle against apartheid in the southern part of Africa, in Angola and South Africa. We even had speakers who were prisoners of war in this anti-apartheid struggle, and they were inside horrific prisons under apartheid rule for years. And then they used to communicate to each other, they were in isolation cells. They used to communicate to each other with this revolutionary song that they learned, and the word is Guantanamera. And I'll just ask all the listeners to go and search for this song, because after hearing the story, when I heard the song, so we had an artist at the conclusion of the conference come and play Guantanamera, and people again, it was very emotional, tears coming down, because this was what kept them alive. So they would say Guantanamera, and then they would know that their comrades are still alive for years. The hope was that Fidel and the revolution would not abandon them, and they didn't abandon them. Just amazing country that is being strangled to a really difficult crisis at the moment. It's on the one hand, it's inspiring and moving. On the other hand, it's also giving me a lot of, it's worrying me. Obviously, we're all worried about the world. But once you go to Cuba, you just feel, you want to protect this.
Now, before we move on to the events and what that signifies for Cuba, maybe we could go back a little bit to the conference. You presented a paper there, so could you describe what that was?
So the paper I presented was based on Che Guevara's message to the original conference. So I studied the text of his message. He wasn't there. He was in Bolivia at the time. But he sent a message to be read at the conference or to be delivered to the participants. And so I studied that text, analyzed his approach, kind of gleaned out what is Che Guevara's approach to imperialism in 1966. And using some contemporary theorists like Samar Amin and kind of who studied imperialism in the 21st century. So I was looking at Che Guevara's approach, what remains relevant and valid, which a lot of stuff is, and what has shifted, kind of thing, So that was my paper. It was well received. But also the whole conference, it was overshadowed by USA's attack on the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela on January 3rd. So the conference started on the 12th, and I was in Cuba. So it was just Victory Day, January 1. January 2 also is a holiday there, public holiday. 3rd of January, that night is when they kidnapped Maduro. And that was really horrific because something kept me awake that night, and I could just hear planes flying above me. I didn't know if it was normal. I checked the news, and because I was already worried, because Trump was escalating his rhetoric against Venezuela. Not only rhetoric, by then over 100 fishermen had been killed off the coast of Venezuela, Colombia. And so he had already started a war, a maritime war, and it was going to escalate any moment. So I was very well aware of that when I was in Cuba. And that night I couldn't sleep at all. And I was just watching this news. What does this mean for Cuba? And then later we learned that more than 100 people were killed in this attack, and 32 of them were Cubans. And
Could I just interject here about
yes,
the killing of the boats, the people on the boats? Of course, there's no actual belligerency there, so those are simply murders.
yes,
They're not acts of war in any
no,
sense. There's no sense that anyone could think of them as combatants. So, yeah, just to just to keep that clear in our minds,
absolutely.
because we don't want to fall into their framing when we talk about these things.
And it's very easy to do so. Like
Oh, absolutely.
I just noticed when I was speaking there, when I said instead of kidnapped, unknowingly it came out as captured because that's what they
Yeah.
feed us. That's what
Yep.
they feed
Absolutely.
us, and it just goes deep into our subconscious, and we
Mm-hmm.
unknowingly parrot their narrative. So it's important,
Yeah.
and important for me to underline here that I was so disappointed when I was there to hear that here in New Zealand, the protests, anti-imperialist protests happening, they kept denouncing Maduro and Trump, and I'm like, what is going on? What this is to me liberal imperialism. It's using the
Mm-hmm.
framework of the empire and trying to be, it's kind of like a performative activism in some ways. You just want to be personally, morally right. Just
Mm-hmm.
shield oneself rather than thinking about what really is going on. What is the structures of the empire? What are the narratives that they said? Are they true? Is he really not a legitimate president? Who is then?
Yeah.
Even after they kidnapped him, they're still not able to install a puppet because the people actually support that government. So,
Yeah. I mean, the thing with this 2024 election was stolen thing, it's literally a case that they have claimed every election was stolen and been proven wrong
that's right.
every time. In this instance, according to the election officials in Venezuela, there was a hack, and that has created enough doubt that suddenly all of these people who, quite frankly, need to really have a good look in the mirror and ask themselves if they have real goodwill, decided, oh no, this time they're not lying. This time it really is the case. But on the one hand, we are told that Corina Machado doesn't have enough support to become president in the country. On the other hand, they're saying that her hand-picked proxy won 80% of the vote, according to one of the ridiculous polls. That, I mean, another poll put it at less, but still, to say that on the one hand they won the election fair and square, but on the other hand they're not popular enough to govern is
Yeah.
quite ridiculous. And I do understand that people, including Venezuelans, may have a different perspective, but we have to go on what we know of the objective numbers, the
And not
objective
just
facts,
that,
not the
like,
individual facts.
yeah, and it's like any country. Like if you ask 10 New Zealanders about New Zealand politics, you'll not hear the same thing, right?
Right.
Like,
This is
um,
absolutely true.
I would argue a vast majority of people here don't even know much about colonization that happened in this country. So if you ask them, if you ask them about the history of colonization of Aotearoa, they probably don't know much. You know what I mean? That doesn't mean that's the truth of New Zealand. So
Mm.
going by hearing a person's individual experience or opinion is not a substitute for analysis. And
Quite right. Yes.
so yeah, and every country has a spectrum, and an important consideration is class location. We have to consider when we see positions, and then people say, oh, my grandmother, my grandfather, something like that, and Cubans in Miami, or people from former Soviet Union, and you ask them, okay, so you were against the Soviets, so who were you supporting during the Second World War? You don't want to go there. You don't want to
No.
go there. So
Well, of
anyway,
course, a very famous Cuban American happens to be their Secretary of State, and he claimed that his family was persecuted by the nasty Cuban regime and claimed it was the communists, when of course it was the Batista regime that had, so I mean, even like, I mean, I think one of the things that makes it difficult for Cuba is that they do have this pool of immigrants who are sometimes
so
um,
loud.
quite zealous, and some of them are useful in doing things like helping the CIA with their drug networks and assassinations and things like attacking Venezuela. So it's this handy pool of zealots.
Oh, yeah, it's handy for the United States,
Mm,
absolutely. But really, really corrosive for, the region, for the
mm,
entire sovereignty of the entire region, and Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean. These people are such, fascistic imperialists, as they're horrible. They're horrible. And there's still some of them
mm,
in Cuba. They haven't, left. Like, I think it was in the
yeah,
80s or the 70s, Fidel said, just leave. He said, just leave. We don't, if you don't feel the
yeah,
spirit of the revolution, please leave. And please take your family with you as well.
yeah.
So, but some of them are obviously still there. And like, so me being as political as I am, whenever I'm walking through the street, I meet someone, I start speaking politics, right? So now and then you meet these people who are very anti, you know? And you can just see the gusano in them, like evil gusano inside them. It's almost like I can't even anyway. But yeah, so yeah, the kidnapping of Maduro was quite a moment in Cuba. To experience that, to be
Mm,
while being in Cuba, was quite something. And
mm,
then and then I decided I don't want to. So I was in a province. I wasn't in Havana at the time, and I missed the protest that happened the day after in Havana. But then I was just so restless. I want to go back to Havana, be there, And so I cut short the trip by maybe 3 days. I was gonna be in the interiors for a week, but I cut short it by three. I was only there for 4 days in the province, and then I came back to
mm,
Havana. And within a couple of days, the mortal remains of the soldiers who were martyred were brought, and there were big public events. So the
mm,
what I was yearning for on Victory Day, which wasn't there because the government was being,
mm,
saving it, it's really struggling at the moment. But
mm,
that happened over there. Thousands of people came to pay respects. So even though it was not, I don't think the government had to spend a lot of money in doing that. They just brought the mortal remains and displayed them in the military headquarters, and we were allowed to go and see them. I was part of that. And the interesting thing, so this was the day after the main part of the conference concluded, and I had met the keynote speaker, Murid Abu Khatir, the Palestinian student. And on the day that I went to pay respects to the martyrs, he was there as one of the first responders because the crowd was so massive that they had deployed paramedics and first responders to take care. And that Palestinian student was there to support this. It was it's just amazing, you know. And anyway, so that happened. And the day after that was this massive anti-imperialist march. It was at the Malecon, which means the waterfront of Havana. And so it started from one side, I don't know how many kilometers, maybe 3 kilometers, or maybe, yeah, 3.5 kilometers. By the time we arrived there, it was early in the morning, right? I don't know when it was, 7 a.m., 7:30, something like that. Because in Havana, protest happens in the morning because in the afternoon it's too hot. So early morning, by the time I got there, the main part was full and I got redirected to the back. And we had to keep walking for kilometers to get to the back. And then, you know, we walked across the waterfront. And the interesting thing is the anti-imperialist square is right in front of the US Embassy. And so we walked past the US Embassy. Many people were showing the middle finger. But the main slogan, which I want to teach our listeners today, is Abajo el imperialismo, which means down with imperialism. And that's one of the first lines in Spanish I learned when I went to Cuba.
Abajo el imperialismo.
That's right, abajo el imperialismo. And like, if you've got a knack for learning language and you know English, it becomes a little bit of, it's not that difficult to learn, I think. Capitalismo, socialismo. You just do lismo instead of lism. Lismo. So abajo el imperialismo. And then, yeah, so, and this famous line from Che Guevara's speech at the United Nations, Patria o muerte, which means motherland or death. And people, when you say that, the crowd responds, venceremos, which means we will overcome.
Now, am I wrong in thinking that that's not a line from his speech so much as it was his speech?
Yeah. It was basically, it was a few lines, and then he ended it with that. So it was the shortest speech in the history of the United Nations.
All right. So there were more other lines,
Yeah. So the anti-imperialist march was crazy. I'll just finish that bit. And so we walked past the US Embassy, and after that, was the Cuban leadership. And the Cuban leadership was just there, like at an arm's length, right? I could touch them really. Obviously, there was some security in front of them, but not really that many. The security people under them, the soldiers, they were just holding the pictures of the martyrs. And so I was able to speak with the leaders of Cuba. And it was really surprising because it was just a week after what happened in Venezuela. And so you'd imagine that the security and, everything would be ramped up and they will be very inaccessible, inside bulletproof something. But they weren't. They were just there. So it was really amazing. And the march itself was amazing. It was young, people of all ages there and all backgrounds. Students, older people from provinces. I met at the conference a lot of the people who are Cuba specialists and people who are scholars from Cuba. They talked to me that Havana doesn't really represent Cuba and that you go into the provinces, you see the love for the revolution more. Havana is more cosmopolitan. It has more kind of different ideas and a lot of even anti-communists. And they say that, the idea is that if you if you say anything against the government, they'll imprison you. But that's ridiculous because, they speak openly. And even if you look online, the discourse is quite open. Like if you look at anything that the government posts, you can see a lot of people who are anti-communist inside Cuba commenting on them very openly, for example. It was one of the most open and free societies I've been to in my life.
So to go back to the conference, so were there any particular highlights from that? And we'll
Yeah,
return
yeah.
to current events later, but we'll just, yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that the all the keynotes were very impressive. I told you about Victor Dreke, and so his presentation
Hmm.
was about Cuban internationalism in Africa, right? What they did in Angola, 1975, until the fall of apartheid in the 90s. They were there supporting the anti-apartheid movement, and we got to see what Cuba, how Cuba commemorated the people who lost their lives in that struggle, and how, Western countries were responding to Cuban internationalism. They were shocked that Cuba sending troops to Africa. They said, does Cuba want their minerals, their gold, and all that? So, yeah, so learning about the Cuban system more. One of the papers was was from a Cuban lawyer from the University of Havana, and she specializes in the legality of the sanctions and all the kind of
Mm,
how it's so, how to navigate the sanctions. That's her specialty. And she
mm,
showed us, how it's not just an embargo, it comes with a
mm,
slew of restrictions and sanctions and things that strangle Cuba. And you can see that these often it's executive orders from the presidents, how they kind of, fluctuate from president to president, but ultimately the embargo and the blockade continues. One of the papers was about Obama's diplomacy during Obama's time, and I found
mm,
that very interesting because Obama gets a lot of praise for quote unquote normalizing relations with Cuba, but he only started doing that towards the end of his term. And ultimately, what he achieved was to open a US embassy in Havana. Apart from that, he refused to lift the embargo.
mm,
He went to Cuba and he kind of tried to use his charm offensive to kind of seduce Cubans into American system. He kind of said, in America, we're about this and that, and we love Cuba. We have some shared values like good food and music or something like that. But in America, we also like this. We like freedoms and, and so he was using his, charisma and his charm to seduce Cubans to actually go against their own state. But ultimately, he could have the bare minimum he could have done if his goal was to normalize relations would be to lift the embargo. And the thing is, the Cuban government kind of responded to it because they wanted the embargo to be lifted in order to prosper. And
mm,
the last 10 years, this is the thing, right? When conditions are so bad, even in Iran, this has happened recently, neoliberalizing or liberalizing the economy. So at the moment, there's a small private sector in Cuban economy.
mm,
According to that a lawyer who's also an economist, it's about 5 to 10% is currently private sector in Cuba. And you can already see that, how that has impacted the people in terms of, you can see some elements of inequality creeping up and,
mm,
inequitable distribution of the resources happening. But 90% of the economy is still under the state, according to this Cuban economist and lawyer. Yeah, and it's just fascinating to be in Havana, in that historic city. I do recommend it, although we have to wait and see what's happening,
mm,
But
mm. If I could just, I have to say that I was watching Al Jazeera tonight, and on Mark Lamont Hill's program, interview program, he had forgotten his name. I do know the guy, one of the political commentators on international relations, who's you know, reasonably big and even considered to be critical of empire,
Mm.
who was saying that Cuba is still failing because it's failing to have a market economy, basically. And it's like very much the same as with Venezuela. They totally erase the fact that there are sanctions. They don't try to account for it. They simply go bad because there's no market economy, and yeah. But as you're saying, the market economy doesn't. It's not China. China had its own reasons for going in a market direction. This is a country the size of Te Waiponamu with 11 million people or something like that.
Yeah, 10.
It is a very different proposition, and
Yeah.
they have done extremely well with what they have in
Oh,
material
yeah.
terms.
Absolutely. It's still a beacon of, of all the best indicators, right? Whether it is maternal mortality, infant mortality,
Mm,
life expectancy, literacy,
mm,
all these indicators of human progress. Cuba is a beacon
mm,
in that region, right? Like, and this is the thing, right? So, and the opening up of the economy has made things worse. It hasn't made things better. And this was in the hope that the US will, relax some of the strangulation,
mm,
but obviously it doesn't do that. And recently in Iran as well, this is one of the reasons which sparked the protest among the merchants, which was then infiltrated by Mossad. One of the reasons were the recent economic policies, which were in response to U.S. sanctions and deliberately devaluing the Iranian rial, the currency, and all that. So yeah, so even if you look at China, so there's a study by Jason Hickel, Dylan Sullivan, these political economists, and they looked at the history of China, and actually in 79, after they liberalized, after Deng Xiaoping's
mm,
liberalization, initially inequality and poverty rose. And then it
mm,
was after,
mm,
the Communist Party brought back the common good principles into the fold of its policies and strengthening the role of the state, it's after that that they started addressing poverty. So that is a recent paper, I think it was published in 2022,
mm,
about poverty and in China, how the market reforms and poverty in China. I highly recommend it to all the listeners
mm,
to read that. But I also recommend another thing is when I was at the conference, I was also learning about Cuban internationalism from the presenters, but also just reading it out of my own interest. And Che Guevara, he visited Gaza in 1959,
mhm.
soon after the
Yeah,
revolution, and
yeah.
and the Gazans gave him a name or something like a liberator or something like that. People in Gaza loved him, and he saw firsthand what was the impact of the Nakba and the displacement and all that. And Cuba has since then been a very strong ally of Gaza, but also he visited Pakistan, he visited India, Sri Lanka in 1959. I think the following year in 1960 he visited Mao in China. And I highly recommend everyone to read the conversation that happened between Mao and Che Guevara, because what they're speaking, if you're not familiar with Marxist theory, this is a good way to kind of understand it. I was so fascinated reading it because this is how you could conduct international relations, is by talking like this. So Mao was like, "Hey, did you expropriate the property of the property of the bourgeoisie?" And then he said, "Ah, yeah, we did to some extent, but we paid some." So this is the thing, right? The Cuban Revolution was far from extremely extreme or violent or anything. They actually
Mhm.
gave some money back to the people when they seized the resources. They actually gave these ruling class people some compensation, although it was half of the market value or whatever. But they still did. They were not, going
Yeah.
around and throwing them on the streets. Everyone still had material security. They were given a compensation and so forth. And then And then Mao says, does Cuba still have a bourgeoisie? It was just, and then, yeah, we have some bourgeoisie who are somewhat, so it's just amazing. I just recommend everyone to read it, where Mao is just interested in learning, because he's just done a revolution in China, which is at a completely different scale. But it's these two revolutionaries having this conversation, and Mao was a little bit, sad that Che didn't go to China in his first trip to Asia. He's like, "Why didn't you come to China?" And then and Che goes, "That's why I'm here, Chairman." So yeah, I highly recommend that. But when you walk through Cuba, you're walking through this revolutionary history, which is not that really long, right? It's 1959. And you just see, and Fidel Castro only died in 2016. So I went to the Fidel Castro Center, and the guides over there, the people who are at Fidel Castro Center, were just amazing. Our guide, he said he's been to Aotearoa, and we met this professor who said he'd come to Aotearoa and had a program with Maori, teaching what was the model, the literacy program in Cuba, to Maori activists over here. So he'd been here, and Australia as well, teaching the indigenous people about the Cuban experience and the Cuban Revolution. So yeah, it was overall amazing. It just makes me, even more committed to my path of anti-imperialism. And I hope more of you join in this path, because this indeed is the biggest threat facing people and the planet as we speak. Imperialism is.
Yeah. Would you like to wrap up at about this point? Yep. Okay. So that did sound like a way to wrap things up. And so
Yeah,
any last thoughts
absolutely.
beyond that?
Yeah, I'll just wrap it up with this. So, just a while ago, I mentioned how people in the West, even when they're opposing imperialism, they have a tendency of denouncing both sides. And I just want to bring the listeners' attention back to what happened in the lead up to the Gaza genocide, right? So the whole idea was that we need to denounce the way that Israel was moving forward, and Israel and its allies was to force everyone to denounce the Palestinian resistance. And the kind of narratives that were churned out about the Palestinian resistance, both before, during, and after October 7, were just crazy, right? And through the course of these 2 years, 4 or 5 months of genocide, what we've understood, a lot of us who are in this path have understood that a vast majority of those narratives are utter bullshit. They're false. The things they said about Hamas on October 7, there's no evidence of mass rapes. There's no evidence of rape. There's no evidence of a deliberate killing of babies. This is what they said, 40 beheaded babies. There's no evidence of that. The things they say about the resistance.
There's not only no evidence of that.
It didn't happen.
Completely, there is no evidence of any instance, any single instance of rape, but you can't rule it out. What we can rule out, we know how many babies were killed. There were 2. We know the circumstances in both instances. One with a stray bullet and one with an Israeli shell, I believe, was the second one. And out of a total of, I think, around 40 children, 40 under 18s, 18 or under.
Yeah, and the primary targets were also military targets at the border between towards Gaza.
Well, I just want to say something, and that is that we should never be sucked in by atrocity propaganda. But another thing that we have to bear in mind is that Palestinians have a right to self-defense, and that means that they have the legal right to carry out armed attacks in Israel. That's well established in international law. So we do not have the moral standing to condemn them, even if we disagree with their actions or think that crimes were committed during those actions. The actions themselves are legal. And because we accepted the condemnation of Hamas, it enabled the Israeli forces to then paint all resistance with the brush of terrorism, if not genocide, because they were claiming genocide, and they have picked up thousands of people for posts on social media, abducted them, tortured them, and terrorized them. And we're currently doing this Red Ribbons campaign, Free Palestinian Hostages. Well, we have enabled everyone who condemned Hamas, enabled the kidnapping of those people by condemning Hamas.
And so the reason why I brought this up, the strategy of the empire of getting us to condemn any resistance to imperialism is because that's exactly what they did in Venezuela. They created this propaganda which made, the average person in the West, in the imperial core, to in some way think, that's fine. Maduro is a bad guy, so it doesn't matter what happens to him, or something like that. So this is the same thing. It's enabling imperialism. So if there's one lesson we can learn from the Gaza genocide, and please learn the lessons. Not only should we oppose and resist the genocide in Gaza, we should avoid that system from doing those same things to people across the world. So when there is a nation that is a target of the empire, we should approach the narratives about the target states of the empire with a lot of critique, a big pinch of salt. Usually the opposite is true. If they say that this is, is illegitimate, he's probably legitimate. If they say that this guy is, is starving the people, they are the ones, the empire is the ones that are starving the people. The same thing they're saying about Cuba now, that the Cuban government is starving the people. No, it's not the Cuban government. It is this embargo, which is even, they're stealing the things that are going to this country, the struggling country. It's horrible. It's horrible. So please stop believing USA's and its allies' propaganda against target states. There's a recent study that came out that since the 1970s till 2021 or 2022, 38 million people died in the global south because of sanctions alone. This is not considering the wars. This is not considering these kind of attacks on fisher folk off the coast of Venezuela. It's not considering drone strikes. It's just sanctions killed 38 million people in the global south. Unilateral sanctions by the United States and its allied nations like the EU. So when the EU and the United States are united against a target state, whether that's Iran, whether that's Venezuela, whether that's Cuba, whether that's China, we need to take these narratives with huge amount of critique. Often the opposite is true, and when you look deeply into it, you'll see that a lot of these crises, even when when there are crises, a lot of those crises are manufactured by the empire to destabilize the region.
And
so for
Cuba,
example,
Cuba has been the testing ground for hybrid warfare for the US. And of course, it also developed things in their coups in Guatemala and Iran. But this ongoing destabilization and developing a sanctions regime that is effectively a blockade because they force other people to comply with it is something that they're doing now with Iran. People trade with Iran at their own risk. So yeah,
absolutely.
So yes, and they do act unilaterally. And with Cuba, every year a vote is held in the UN General Assembly to condemn the blockade of Cuba, and almost everyone votes for it, and then they do nothing about it.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, all the Western banks, like my bank account, I couldn't even access my bank account. I couldn't access internet banking using, everything was blocked. And I have an account with ANZ, and I called them up and I said, Australia is not sanctioning Cuba, neither is New Zealand. So why is it that I can't use my card? And then obviously the whole entire financial system of the world is, dominated by the United States, and they follow the US laws and not our countries. This is why we're saying that the imperial system headed by the United States, this is one, I want to conclude with that. a quote by Che Guevara from his message to the Tricontinental. He said, while envisaging the destruction of imperialism, we need to identify its head, which is no other than the United States of America. And this is what I experienced there, how they are strangling Cuba, how they are genociding Gaza, how they are completely flouting the dignity of a sovereign nation like Venezuela, how they are strangling a dignified nation like Iran, the people of Iran struggling. This is an empire that is, it has such horrible features, which we are seeing in the Epstein files. And this is a threat. These people have no morals. These are the savages. It's not people in the global south that are savages. It's not the working class that are savages. It is the ruling class at the top of this global imperial system. They are the savages. They are the barbarians. They are the ones who have lost their humanity. And so that's my concluding message, remembering Che Guevara's message to the Tricontinental. Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Josephine. And thank you all for listening to this special episode of 1 of 200.
Kakitiano.
If artificers are denied, living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's apart now. It's paved with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking rain. It feels like we're on the road to hell.